And now, Heather, please tell us about illicit financial flows.
Sure. I'd like to say thank you very much to New Rules for Global Finance and the Heinrich Böll Foundation for inviting me to speak here today on this very important and obviously very timely topic. My name is Heather Lowe, and I'm Legal Counsel and Director of Government Affairs at Global Financial Integrity. Global Financial Integrity is a nonprofit here in Washington, D.C. that attempts to quantify illicit capital flight leaving developing countries and find ways to curtail that illicit capital flight. Our most recent estimates of illicit capital flight from developing countries alone are on the order of $750 billion to $1 trillion per year over the last few years. That figure, just to put it in some context, is about 7 to 10 times ODA. So our definition of illicit capital flight is where the movement of money is breaking laws either in the country of origin, a country of transit, or a country of destination. We look at how the international financial system facilitates and often encourages this kind of illicit capital flight from developing countries. Our fundamental interest in this issue is development-based, but it's become increasingly clear to us that illicit capital flight is a serious problem not only for developing countries, but for developed countries as well. It's also not just an economic issue, it's also a national security issue. And that's becoming more and more obvious as we see the uprisings around the world, a lot of which is very much economic based. Surprisingly, this is actually pretty good news. It means that the major financial centers that are a significant part of the illicit capital flight problem have a real incentive to do something about it. The majority of the activity that we are measuring in our numbers is recorded trade flows. So in very simplified terms, it means that about $750 billion is not recorded or has gone missing from trade transactions with developing countries. That means that taxes and customs duties are likely not being collected on those transfers, and they're likely distorting local markets in developing countries. The questions that we ask at Global Financial Integrity are, how is that money moving and where is it going? Those aren't easy questions to answer at all. A lot of people are spending a lot of time on those questions these days. We know that a great deal of money is ending up in what are often called tax havens. We call them secrecy jurisdictions because secrecy is really the element that is critical to this shift. Just so we're all on the same page, we do consider the U.S. to be a tax haven or a secrecy jurisdiction for money coming in from other countries, including developing countries, as are most of the major financial centers in the world. We also know that the movement of illicit money around the world is very much facilitated by anonymous shell corporations, which are companies for which the actual person or persons who own them are completely unknown. It's incredibly easy to create an anonymous shell company here in the U.S. in almost any state in the U.S., as it is in fact easy to create an anonymous shell company in pretty much any country in the world. So those are the two issues that I'll just focus on today with respect to the administration, that is secrecy jurisdictions and anonymous shell companies. So let's get down to the topic at hand, new strategies for a new administration. In the area of illicit financial flows, I'm actually pleased to say that means a lot of turning words into actions. The Obama administration has recognized the detrimental effects of illicit financial flows and has launched the Domestic Financing for Development initiative to elevate these issues in relevant U.S. agencies. The administration seems to have grasped the concept that the use of tax havens to avoid taxes, to evade taxes, and simply to hide proceeds of corruption and other crime, and the use of anonymous shell companies are bad for both developed and developing countries alike. They've realized that financial transparency is a key factor to economic growth. Now that the words are on paper, however, we really need to see this action carried through, and this is the perfect opportunity to do that with the new administration. So in the area of anonymous corporations, in the U.S.'s Open Government Partnership Action Plan, the administration actually committed to advocate for legislation requiring meaningful disclosure of corporate ownership information. That's great. It also referred to the need to address this issue in its strategy to combat transnational organized crime. There's been little movement on the issue, however, and that, of course, is the problem. So what can be done here? While greater advocacy by the administration at the state level and in Congress would certainly be welcome and helpful, the federal government does have the ability to require companies to disclose their ownership information to the federal government at the federal level, which would bypass the states entirely. The states have been the problem in this whole process. State governments in the U.S. Have the authority and ability to create companies in their own jurisdictions, and that is very much a state's right as opposed to a federal right. And so it's been very difficult to get them to move to a position where they're willing to require this disclosure. So far, the administration has been unwilling to present such an approach, a sort of federal response to this this problem, although Representatives Maloney, Frank, and Lynch in the House of Representatives have, in fact, in this past Congress, introduced a bill which would require just that. So the administration really has a few options on how to tackle this particular problem in the U.S., and in fact, it's actually one of the easier problems to solve. You know what the problem is, and you know what the solution is. You just have to decide how you want to go about implementing that solution. We'd also, of course, like to see much stronger and more strident position being taken on this issue internationally. As I said, this is a problem around the world, and it facilitates all sorts of illicit capital movement around the world, whether that's just tax evasion or, hiding human trafficking money or drug money. Of course, this is very difficult for the U.S. to do unless we actually have our own house in order. So first things first, let's fix the U.S. on this. So let's switch now to the secrecy jurisdiction issue. The U.S. has been central to the G20 discussions about banking secrecy and bank secrecy jurisdictions, and has taken some very concrete measures to address this. A lot of them have been very American-focused, however. So first of all, the U.S. is now requiring that banks report to the U.S. government all non-U.S. citizens and companies that hold accounts in U.S. banks. That probably is surprising to you. You probably didn't realize that the U.S. government didn't actually know what foreigners had accounts in the U.S. unless they were their U.S. securities accounts. So there's that sort of big black hole. This measure should really decrease the use of the U.S. as a tax haven and our banks as banks for international crime syndicates, because with that information going to the U.S. government can then work with that information. So that's a very positive step. That regulation was first introduced by President Clinton and had not been adopted until now. So it's taken that long, literally, to get that problem fixed. They've also, through the implementation of FATCA, which is the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, made great strides in preventing Americans from stashing their money in banks abroad to evade U.S. taxes. That, again, is the American focus, right? But this conference is, and this discussion is about developing countries. So the associated benefit here is that because of this really aggressive U.S. law, other countries are demanding reciprocity from the U.S. government. So, for example, Mexico just signed a reciprocity agreement with the U.S. so that the U.S. has to send Mexico information about Mexican citizens and companies that have accounts in the U.S., which should help Mexico crack down on its own tax evaders, not to mention random criminals that are stashing their money in U.S. banks. The U.S. has finally opened the door, as it were, to this concept of automatic exchange of tax information in a very wide way. This is, as I said, this is really considered automatic exchange of tax information, which is a shift from what has been an exchange of tax information upon request, which is the international standard. So what else can be done here by the U.S., by the administration? So while the U.S. is engaging in this level of financial transparency, they're still not advocating for it at the international level, and that means at the OECD. The U.S. should be advocating for a concrete policy shift at the OECD toward automatic exchange of tax information. By the way, just so you are aware, this concept of automatic exchange of tax information already exists within the EU. The EU member states already engage in automatic exchange of tax information for personal accounts, not yet for corporate accounts. Following along that line of thinking, the U.S. should also be approaching developing countries and offering automatic information exchange agreements. It's unclear whether the U.S. is pursuing this approach at the moment, and I'd really like to encourage that to happen. We now certainly have the framework and the tools in place to do that. The administration should also be taking a much stronger stance with our businesses, closing the type of tax loopholes that incentivize U.S. companies to profit shift their profits from the U.S. and developing countries into tax havens. It perpetuates the system that undermines what is our social contract, and that is that taxes are the price that we pay for a stable government and for developed infrastructure. And with that, I will end, and I'm happy to discuss and take questions and think more things through with you in questions.
Thank you, Heather. I didn't realize we had the automatic exchange of information with Mexico now. There has been a letter from the head of the Central Bank of Mexico sitting on the desk of the appropriate U.S. authority for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
Just sitting there. Karsten's, right?
Yeah. Yes.
No answer for years.
Yeah. Can I clarify?
Sure.
The agreement, I think, was signed yesterday or the day before, and I haven't seen the agreement yet. So
Okay.
I think it should follow the same framework that the other agreements are drafted. I see no reason why it should differ. Haven't read it yet, though, so just a cautionary note there.
You can tell she's a lawyer. I'm a political scientist. I think that's an oxymoron, but anyway, I'm very delighted to learn that. And I think that maybe USAID's targeted work in tax administration would probably be welcomed by countries if there's automatic exchange of information to track money. Then you're going to need the tax administration capacity to do it, which USAID can help with. There we go.